Hello everyone. Happy New Year. This is our first API review since I think early December, because we lost quorum, I think, pretty much in the beginning of December. So a few issues have piled up. Now we have 27. Hopefully we get through the top 10 today. Let me just open a few here up. It's a bit easier. Eric, do you want to talk about this one?
Yeah, sure, can go. So this request is pretty straightforward. It's basically to extend the link zip method with overloads for more arities. The number we can go is to be determined in this meeting, and providing the equivalent iQueryable implementations. That's about it, really.
So for the enumerable one, it seems pretty straightforward. But what do we have to do anything for iQueryable? I mean, there are implementations of iQueryable, right?
Yeah, for the pair, there already exists an iQueryable implementation. So the addition basically consists of replicating that implementation for larger arities.
And iQueryable is really a static class, not an interface?
Sorry, that's a typo. It should have been queryable, I think.
I see. Okay, let me just copy paste this then.
But I guess the open question here is what is sort of the maximum arity would be, happy to include here.
So this I know F# essentially is a shortcut for just calling zip multiple times, right?
Correct.
C# tuples stop at 7, so that's one way to decide.
Framework design guidelines stop at 3. But we can decide that this one's just syntactic sugar, like tuple.create methods.
So I've been doing a little bit of F# and advent of code, and I think in F# it goes up to zip 3, and there you'd use it more than in C#.
Yeah, I mean, I used link quite a lot in a previous life. I think I would have had a use for 3 arguments. I don't know if I've ever used or needed more than 3.
You can just start with 3 and see how it goes. I mean,
I think that's a good idea.
I mean, personally, I think I've never used it with more than 2.
Yeah, I mean, during advent of code, I did use probably some triplets, but not from something like enumerable.zip. It was just list of triplets. But yeah, so either we can do 3 because that's where the guidelines stop, or we can do 4 because we don't think anyone will need it. And we should never hear of 5. We hope. I'm okay with either way.
Well, I mean,
though we should call it T4.
Just to play devil's advocate here, not many people need this. Is it worth adding?
Probably.
Like, how many people have reached this?
3 is not particularly uncommon. I've used 3. And I suspect, let's say, 1% of .NET users will use 3 at some point. That's still thousands of people. Tens of thousands, probably.
And I also don't really see it as getting in your way. I mean, they're overloads, so you don't need to come up with new names for them like you do in F#.
Yeah, I mean, the coding experience, I think, is fine adding these. It does increase the library size, but probably negligibly.
Yeah, I mean, I assume we don't do anything like super fancy in the implementation, right? It's hopefully fairly straightforward, right?
Feel. I think I wrote the first one, and it's basically just calling an existing zip implementation. The zip implementation just takes like a function and applies it effectively.
I think it's like a 5 or 6 line iterator. It's not a big implementation, code wise. And the C# compiler goes off and generates a lot of stuff, but for the developer, it's minimal.
Using, while, yield, return. So the 3 would be add a third using.
Yeah, I mean, there's a legitimate point that maybe the code gen could be more efficient, but I don't think it's a.
Oh, I wasn't criticizing the C# compiler. I was thanking it for all of its effort on it.
All right, so should we do 3, and we think that now we're through more than 99% of the use cases of enumerable.zip, and cut it off there, and we'll add more. We'll debate more if people ask for it.
Sounds good to me.
I think
and actually ask for concrete examples.
This one only does the tuple one, right? Should we also have the action one? Does it take more arguments already, or how does that work? You know, the one that takes the T result selector as a func.
It also only takes 2 enumerables.
Yeah, Eric, should we add one for that as well, or should we not?
I wouldn't. I think that made more sense when we didn't have system.value tuple and conventions around it.
Yeah, I think since we have the tuple one, I think I've never ever used the selector one. All right, then let's do that.
Has it been a while since you used this computer email? Not signed into GitHub?
Probably. I'm not signed in, yeah. What the heck? Yeah, I think it might also be that all the cookies expired now. There we go. Alright, so we decided not to add an overload for the one taking the result selector. Alright, then
Now that we weren't doing the one with the selector.
I thought we were not.
Okay, we both thought the same thing, but I thought you pasted it in.
Let me check then. Hold on. Oh, I should have said not now. Close enough. Alrighty. Then one down. Let me refresh this page here. Wasn't that the one we just looked at? Was it a different one?
That's the one we just looked at.
I was about to say. Alright, so this one. Andy, I think this is yours, right?
So there's some like controversy about the design, so I'm gonna have to lean on you a bit for knowledge about the platform analysis stuff, the capability and analyzers. So the basic idea is that we want some way to mark that some API is not compatible with the single file published stuff
Mm-hmm.
that we introduced. Because we no longer extract to disk, certain operations just aren't possible. The primary one being assembly.location. Right now, we have an analyzer that's shipped in .NET 5 that if you have the published trimmed property set to true, it runs and then it warns on every single use of assembly.location saying, unless you're absolutely certain that you loaded this DLL from something like assembly.loadFrom, this probably is not going to return something useful. The goal is that we would like first to get the ability for other users to mark things as being not safe to use in in single file. And we'd also like to reduce some of the burden of like a handwritten analyzer a little bit by being able to turn it into a single attribute that we put everywhere.
Right.
The controversy is whether or not this is actually a capability and should be folded into something like the capability analyzers.
Yeah, so this one doesn't exist yet, right? So there's a spec for that I thought about, but we haven't implemented it yet. So the question really becomes like, what would you think the future of this would be? So the question is, do you envision, for example, an API that somebody would have to check and say, I don't know, if runtime feature is single file mode or something?
I was thinking about that last night. The problem is that we could actually break this out into two separate things. There's the question of, does an assembly have a location? That is, does it exist on disk or not? And there's a question of, are we using single file mode? Which is probably approximately like, does core lib exist on disk, right? The first, does this assembly exist on disk or not, is an existing thing that we've always had. You can load, well, not always, but you've been able to load assemblies from memory for a very long time. Mm-hmm. It's reasonable to ask, is there a capability here? Like, we could add a new API. Right now, the way that people check to see whether an assembly is loaded from memory is grab the assembly object, do assembly.location, and check to see if it's empty, if it's an empty string. We could add an API, is loaded from memory, to system.assembly. And then we could say, the way you check this is you do that. And then if you call assembly.location without checking that first, that's a warning, right? I think the biggest problem there is, first of all, that's not what anybody has done for the past, 5-6 years or something. They all do assembly.location is empty, which is the thing that, that's the thing we would warn them about if we actually made this public. So the first thing is, everybody doing it right suddenly gets a warning. And then if we end up narrowing it down to just the single file, the is single file property is set to true, mm-hmm. Then it's not really about that capability anymore, right? It's about this specific property of single fileness, which is a second capability that we could also introduce a second check for, but it's not the same check. Asking if the entire bundle, if your entire application was bundled as a single file, is a different check than asking if an assembly was loaded from memory.
Right.
And in most cases, we would recommend people use the latter, right? It's better to, if you're going to do assembly stuff, it's better to narrowly scope your question down to the thing that you actually care about, rather than asking the broad question. And we could add a single file unsupported and a is single file API, but it's a lot more niche, and I'm not sure it's that useful, because to some extent, I'm not even sure that's useful for developers, because if an assembly is loaded from memory, you could probably do something else. If an assembly is loaded from single file, I'm not exactly sure what the correct behavior in that situation would be. I don't know. I just don't have a user scenario that this fits well with. Maybe WPF's file mapping thing, where they store files next to the application, and then they have a query syntax for kind of accessing them. Presumably in a single file scenario, to avoid kind of littering files next to the unnecessarily littering files, you would use embedded resources. So they could theoretically like swap off between embedding unit resources and using this next to the assembly or next to the application thing. But that's, I don't know why you would do that, right? I personally would just switch to the embedded resource thing only, and then give a warning for using the query syntax stuff unconditionally. Just like don't use it.
What else besides assembly location changes behavior in single file, or breaks, if you will?
So there are a few APIs listed here. So assembly location, module fully qualified name, module name, assembly.getFile or get files. Code base, they don't actually, they throw, which is, like they're also obsolete. So the warnings are in some sense like unimportant, right? It's obsolete. You'll get an obsolete warning. And those are the ones in the framework that we know of. In terms of practical import, it's all assembly location. Every single use that matters is assembly.location.
What's wrong?
And these are already things that had problems if you use something like IElement, right?
Well, sure. Anything that's loaded in memory, right? Just like spit a byte array and load it, or even like grab a byte array from a resource and load it, like Roslyn does for every single one of its tests.
Right. So single file's making this more apparent, but these are existing complexities of the existing APIs. It's not new with the single file scenario.
Correct. The newness is really that that people may not recognize that setting this property in your project file, essentially setting your deployment mechanism, requires you to think about this, which is why the warning exists.
So what's wrong with qualified name and simple name for modules? Like what would they change?
I believe, let me look it up. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Because assembly name hopefully doesn't change, right? Because that's that would be bad.
Yeah, so it's the behavior for loading for memory. Basically, we matched the behavior for loading for memory. It's always in brackets unknown when you load it for memory.
Interesting. So if you have a multi-module, which nobody has, but if you do, then it just says bracket unknown if you do single file rather than the actual module name.
Yeah, or it throws because of deployment issues. But that one's arguable bug. I don't know. Whatever. Also, fully qualified name, I believe, actually contains the path. Yeah, it contains the path. So that one returns unknown as well.
Okay.
In 3.0, there was like a base directory that broke because you're a single file. Right? Like I'm wondering, is there other things like that where it's like behavior changing that you actually want to be able to check, am I in single file mode?
Behavior changing, we don't warn about because the behavior might be desirable or undesirable based on your circumstances, right? Like there's no good.
But
good
it's not about
situation.
warning. It's about, do we need an API to say, is this current application running in single file mode?
Yeah, I guess the question Eric is raising is more along the lines of like, if something has changed, do you expect people to have two code paths, one for single file and one for not single file? Because if, for example, if you're a library, you probably need that because you don't know what the deployment model ends up being for the app, right? And so
Kind of. If the thing you're doing is accessing like resources next to your assembly, then the fix is to use embedded resources and don't call assembly.location, right? Like 99% of the situations I've seen of this are people call assembly.location and they should not.
Well,
And
another
if somebody
scenario
fixed
there
it by calling is single file, I would say you're doing that wrong, right? Because you've now fixed single file, but you haven't fixed somebody's loading you from a byte array.
Another scenario is I have a config file next to my application that I want users to edit.
Mm-hmm.
How do I get to that location?
App context.base directory.
And we broke that in 3.0 with single file.
Yes, and then we fixed it in 3.1. Like that was just a bug.
No, it still broke in the 3.0. In 5.0, we fixed it in 5.0 because we don't spit it out to temp directory anymore. But you can still flip that switch on.
Because you
there's another switch.
We broke it in the sense that it's not next to your application, it's in the extraction directory.
Right, exactly.
Except
that's why I was asking.
Maybe the right thing. Like that's the question.
It's not the right thing in the scenario where I want a config file next to my exe that I want users to edit.
That's correct, but it is the right thing in the case where you want a config file next to your assembly. It's both correct and incorrect depending upon your scenario. That's what I'm saying.
I agree with that. So that's why I'm asking, are there more behavior changing APIs when you go into single file mode that somebody would need to be able to check? Am I in single file mode because I want to do different things?
Right. I think
if it's all about assemblies, then I don't think we need it.
I mean, considering how much stuff we have in .NET that just deals with assembly loading and derived features, I'd be shocked if there wouldn't be more, but it's probably also fair to say it's not mainstream enough that we don't know the long tail yet.
Yeah, I don't have anything on my radar that we would be interested in adding. So for one, because we're no longer doing extraction except for native binaries, that all that gets a little bit simpler, right? App context-based directory returns the location of the exe. There's a lot less complexity there. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the proposal would be in those situations. I do know one API which we would consider adding, which is ask for the location of the extraction directory of the native assemblies. But I'm not sure that that's the same thing as is single file bundle, right? Because it's not even this, that's not even necessarily true, because you don't have to set native binaries for self-extraction. You could just let them sit next to your application, in which case there would be no extraction directory, but single file would probably return true.
Do we have any APIs that talk about a deployment model? Like I feel like somewhere there's a, something that you can ask if you're an AppX container thing, and maybe somewhere there's the am I hosted by IIS instead of by the normal XeShim and other things. Like, is this a thing that fits somewhere to ask this question? Otherwise, it does sound like we do want assembly dot is loaded from memory or is ephemeral or whatever we want to call that, because it does sound like adding a property on assemblies for I wasn't loaded from disk. So things are, now you'll see why all these other things are weird. It solves the described problem, and I've yet to see where the attribute comes in handy.
Well, we still need something to let people mark their things as I would like a warning for this. And also we would like to clean up all the places in the code where we have a handwritten analyze.
But when would that turn on? Like, do you have to just explicitly opt into this particular analyzer? Because if you're writing an application and you're not single file, you don't care. If you're writing a library for yourself and you don't care about single file deployment, you don't care. And if you're writing a library otherwise, then it's like browser, maybe you care. So like you kind of need to opt in to know whether or not this thing is going to apply to any scenario you ever care about.
If you publish as a single file, then you're definitely going to opt in by that.
But only the executable that's being built would know that, unless you're going to somehow do a.
Yeah, we want to do
walk.
IL analysis in the future.
Okay, because if I mean, and then that could even still be wrong. Just because it gets called doesn't mean it's callable in a path that could have been hit from the single file deployment. But
that's totally fair, right? And that's the like capability model that Emo's designing. And so that's basically my question here. Is there a capability model that we want to buy into here, and how?
I mean, to me, capability, the original idea of the capability one was basically to say, the platform support one that we currently have is kind of unconditional, right? You just say, this API exists or it doesn't exist, and then we just said the platform checks are the corresponding capability APIs. And then the question was, can I generalize this? So, for example, that we can say, I don't know, when you have a registry, instead of saying is Windows, you would say registry.is supported, right? But I think the problem, I think, would be like in your case, you want an instance member on the assembly, right? Versus in my case, it would just be a static thing because it used the feature is either available or it's not. So it wouldn't be an instance specific property. Versus in your case, it would be, well, this particular assembly has, has a location, so you can ask this one, but it doesn't mean you can ask any other assembly for a location, right? And so that one, I don't think the existing proposal handles at all. And then I think the other question that is still kind of, I think, open is, does the abstraction even buy us much, right? Because the question really boils down to, how specific are the capability checks that you want, and how do you tie them from the properties or, methods back to the capability-based API checks, and that might be more complicated than just having specific features.
How do we do potentially expensive flow analysis to trace the assembly instance across?
Exactly. So that's why I didn't handle that. I just said, like, I would only do flow analysis, and then it's just a static check that you do, right? As soon as you do instance level checking, then it gets a lot more complicated. And so then the question is,
it also seems problematic to enable that. Like, if we make it more generalizable than what we have here, which is like single file unsupported, and we make it is assembly in memory, right? Then the corresponding broadening would be to stop turning this analyzer on only for published single file and turn it on all the time. But that seems like really noisy.
Right. It's like warning for doesn't work in Blazor of many people don't care.
I think this was the other question that Jeremy kind of implicitly asked, which is how do I opt in, right? Because I think similar to libraries, like if you build a Blazor app, then we only opt you into one for Blazor APIs that are unsupported, but we don't do that for libraries by default. But you can do something to your project to say, I still want to know whether I don't work in Blazor because I intend this to work in Blazor. So in your case, the question would be, is what's the opt-in mechanism for these kind of things? And that might just be, I don't know, a warning entry in the project file that says, I want to know about, I don't know, single file issues, right? And I think that's kind of the user experience that we think we should think about, so that we don't have, for this analyzer, it's this opt-in mechanism, for this analyzer, it's that opt-in mechanism. It should be, hopefully somewhat uniform for that. But I think the general, like, I think capability-based analysis, it's more a concept. I think the way we want to model these things. So, for example, if we say, there is an API that is unsupported in a certain scenario, how do I check for that scenario? And hopefully there should be a pretty straightforward pattern that I can use. And the pattern might be as simple as saying, if assembly.location, string is null or empty or something, right? And that might be okay, right? Obviously, there's a dedicated API for that. I think in your case, when you have like 12 properties, it might be not insane to say the person just checks the property itself, right? But if some of them throw and some of them don't throw, then that also goes out the window a little bit, right? In which case the pattern would get more complicated, in which case probably an API would make more sense.
Luckily, none of them throw. The only ones that throw are the ones that are obsolete and should not be called, period.
I see.
Yeah,
so
like,
if you always get
my
a warning,
feeling,
then that's fine.
Yeah, my feeling's sort of like, we're talking a half dozen to a dozen things. If we're adding a new attribute to drive an analyzer, then it only works in net 6 plus this seems small enough that special casing and analyzer just seems better. Plus, it's not, none of these APIs are unsupported in single file, which is what the attribute says. They just probably don't do what you kind of want them to do, because as you mentioned, you could assembly.load to load a sidecar assembly and it has a location. Just because the main components of your application doesn't mean that nothing does. Versus the stuff that we've painted in browser with browser unsupported is like, no, really, like this is just gonna throw. It's dead. There is no workaround. There's no subtlety. It's this API does not work. Check it before you call it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So the question would be, what do we do about the user? Basically, what do we do about APIs that a library offers that depend on, let's say, just assembly being on disk? Presumably, you want some indication on the user side that those things won't work.
Yeah, I had the same question, because like if you think just about Math v1, for example, right? Math v1 has a directory catalog, right? That basically you instantiate it with a path and then it finds all assemblies and loads that. Most of the time people will instantiate that with the application directory, in which case the catalog would be empty, right? So it will work, but it won't do what you want it to do, right? And so I think that's kind of the question, I think, is like, how do you bubble this up, right? How do we and attributes are convenient to do that, right? Because then you find all the locations in your code that uses APIs that are marked, and then you can decide which of your own stuff you're marked with this attribute, right? And then presumably the analyzer is smart enough to suppress any warnings that occur in APIs that are already marked with this attribute, right?
Yeah, the model is that our idea is that for single file unsupported, or whatever we would like to call it, if you have that on your method, then any warning that would be produced by the analyzer about single file unsupported would be silenced by having the attribute. Effectively, it's viral. It just moves up the chain.
Yeah, that's I think a pretty common pattern that we have for these things. I mean, then the question really becomes is single file unsupported the right terminology? Because it's more, single file interesting behavior attribute, right? Because it might depend on the thing that you're applying it to, what it actually does.
The end user would still get a warning though, right? Because you're going to do the full IL traversal.
So that's,
or you just want to move it to
that's a long-term plan, but that's not necessarily plan for 6.
Yeah, the current
full IL analysis is something we would like to do, but we don't necessarily have great infrastructure to do it.
Right. So currently, this would be a Roslyn analyzer just on the compilation, or on the whenever analyzers run during the whole build and develop experience.
Right. Yeah, but remember that if they so right now, if you do this today, then you'll get a warning on your code if you call assembly.location and then publish as a single file, right? The difference is that if we make this viral, then other libraries could slap this attribute on their methods. And then in this case, the user who's actually writing their app would get a warning from the analyzer about using an API from a third-party library that's not supported or doesn't work properly.
Or even our own, right? I mean, as I said, like Math v1 would be an example of that.
But in a 2-library dependency model, I'm just making sure we understand what we're talking about here.
Chain is broken.
Newtonsoft JSON adds one of these things. Azure SDK doesn't add one of these because they weren't compiling with the extra I want to know when I've used this thing warnings. You're using the Azure SDK. You completely don't notice that you now have so you have an implicit dependency and you don't get the warning. Yeah,
that's right.
And I think only IL analysis can truly solve that.
Right.
Oh, that
so
creates other problems.
What would I do? What would I do if I'm an app developer who uses library A that's got one of these APIs that are marked with this, and I get a warning? Now what? Like, do I switch? I can't call that API. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's no way for me to switch. It's better in the library case, right? in the Azure SDK case, they get the warning. How do they know whether they should call that API or not?
Yeah, I guess my question for Andy is like ignore third party. Just say it's all in one solution. I have an app project that references a library project, and then my library project does the thing, and then my app project just calls for library project. That is also dropped on the floor right now, even though in this case we kind of know what the closure is, right?
You'd get a warning in the library project.
My understanding is that not by default, right? Because we don't opt libraries in by default to say give me single file warnings because we assume they are very noisy. So by default, the library wouldn't get a warning, and then the app wouldn't get one either because, well, the app didn't know about it.
Oh, I thought this analyzer ran all the time.
It runs if you set publish single file to true.
Right, which is only set by the application,
Yep.
so the library would never set that, right?
Right.
That I'm not so sure of. I mean, properties in MS Build are global.
But they're global per project, right?
Yeah, that's actually, I don't think that's true, but I do think that this one is scoped down. I think you will. So, for example, if you set -p publish single file equals true.
Well, if you do it on the command line,
build,
yes,
yeah.
I believe that's true. If you do it on the command line, then they become global properties
Right.
that are
So
overriding.
then the answer is just like, what kind of MS Build magic do you have going on? If you set it in a shared props file, then you'll probably set it everywhere. If you set it only in the XE project, you only set it in the XE project.
Yeah, I guess that now the question is how do you actually deploy, right? If you do it via command line, you set /p blah, then it will probably.
It would also depend on whether MS Build decided that the library needed to be rebuilt with you specified.
Correct.
/p. So
yes, this is I don't have a solution for this. This is just this system we built.
Yeah. So my big concern with this is really the word unsupported, because single file makes this problem more apparent, but in single file it's not always broken, and it's sometimes broken outside of single file. So it's not really related to single file, and it's not really unsupported. And so this is really like, requires assembly on disk.
That's fair, but I do want to point out that sometimes we get overly abstract and then end up confusing people in the process. This is a common problem with the C# compiler, where we give some terminology that's technically correct. It's like, that's a invalid identifier, and people are like, what the hell does that mean?
It means it starts with a number.
Right.
Or, anything that's not a Unicode letter.
And that doesn't actually help people, even though it is technically correct.
Yeah, I think the challenge here is that the other case where this can happen, meaning you load it in assembly from byte array, is so excessively rare in practice that it doesn't really matter, right? The reason why people are broken by this most often will be because somebody enabled single file, right? And so that's why it's probably more
Well, I think
useful.
It's notable that we would probably only turn the analyzer on if the single file analysis flag is set, because it's otherwise too noisy.
Right, but it's the same thing. So let's say you turn it on because of single file, but then the error message is something like, well, this could be the dynamically generated assembly, so please make sure to check whether the location is not null or something. And people are like, what the fuck are you talking about, right? That doesn't make any sense for what I'm doing. And so I think that's why I think I could live with single file as being the thing. I mean, unsupported might be a bit of a strong term here, because to me, unsupported means the API will throw, which it wouldn't. It would just give you not useful answers potentially, right? And so that might be the nuance if you want to figure out. But I don't know what to say. Like, single file, please think about this attribute is also
single file impacted, single file affected.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it also depends on what the message would be, right? If the message is more along the lines of like, this API may not be supported or may produce incorrect results in single file, I think it's probably fine, right?
Yeah, so the message would probably be something generic like that, and then the attribute takes a string parameter for the message, and then that's an additional message that the person who's applying the attribute can put in.
Well, must put in.
Along with a URL to point to an explanation of the problem.
I mean, your current design, the user has to provide a message all the time, right? So that would also mean that, so that means, whatever the messages the user put in, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm not a fan of messages and attributes anymore because you can't localize them.
I don't like it either.
Changing them is very, very hard because you basically have to rev the platform to do it.
So for our own stuff, we can use the I was thinking about this. We can use the message as a key. We can actually just look at the message, use it as a dictionary lookup, and then look in a resource file for a localized version of that message.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like, I thought about this because I was like, what could we possibly, like, are we backing ourselves into a corner here if we do this? And the answer is no. And also for third-party applications, I don't have a better alternative, right? There's no way that they can ship us localized resources for their...
No, that's why I think, like, to me, the pattern would be you would not have a message and we would just have an optional URL, right? And so if you want to provide details, you provide a URL, and then whoever authors the library controls what's behind that URL, and that can be localized or cannot be localized, right? That's depending on what they're doing.
It's fair.
That's what I would do, like, because the other problem with messages is you realistically have, like, I don't know, 60 characters, right, to express yourself, which might not be enough. So you might always want a URL anyway. So that's why I would be probably more okay with saying no message, but you have a URL, right? And then that's where you put the details. And then we control the message because it's generic directly in the analyzer. And so every time we ship the analyzer, we can change the message.
I think this is viable for single file because it's rare enough and specific enough that we could do that. But for like the linker, it would be a nightmare to try and you would get the same generic message and then you would have to go to a URL in order to figure out what the problem is the linker is complaining about. That would be awful.
Yeah, I think like if you have one attribute that can basically give you different error cases, then yes. But maybe that's also then not the best design to have a single attribute for that. But yeah, I mean, obsolete is kind of similar in the way we do it in obsolation. We just say, well, you have a diagnostic ID, right, and that's your key realistically. But yeah, I mean, I think in general, like, I don't know what you want to get out of this, but like, it's turned more into a feature discussion. I think to me, the name of the attribute, you know, modulo the weirdness that Jeremy would talked about seems fine.
So I guess my conclusion here was, do we want to go back to the drawing board and use a completely different framework, namely like the capability analysis stuff? I didn't see a compelling reason to do that, right? That if that were the conclusion, then I would say we should close this and come back with something completely different, right? I don't hear that that's the strategy we want. I could also see us splitting it into two and talking about, you know, just in-memory stuff and just single file stuff. I also don't hear like that is particularly useful. So I'm settling back onto, I think the thing that we have here is roughly what we want, and the question is purely up to, you know, what's the name of the attribute and what parameters does it take?
Yeah, and it probably wants its targets expanded to, you know, everything. You can have an event that doesn't work in single file.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And then property means that people don't have to be confused of, I want to put it on the property, that's not applicable, but it is.
Yeah, it totally could be.
You need to move it to the get.
I mean, one thing,
assembly.locate, it wouldn't work for assembly.location, so that's a problem.
Well, I think, yeah, in the example, it's they put it, you know,
on the getter.
They painted the get.
Still, yeah.
I mean, the one thing I would say is, like, I think earlier we discussed about having capability API for, you know, determining whether you run in single file mode or not. And I think Andy said, like, it's too broad of a net. And while I agree with that, in practice we often end up needing something like that because there's additional subtlety that you can't express purely with things like, you know, this assembly has a location or not. So we may want to consider doing that regardless, so that when there is weird bugs like the one that Eric mentioned, where we, you know, another API doesn't work always the way we want, people have at least a way to detect it and do something semi-useful in those cases. Because I mean,
I think that's that's completely reasonable, right? Like, I guess my claim here was more, I'm not sure that adding that API affects this particular API.
Yeah,
service.
I think it's fair to say you generally don't expect people to query that and then have an if and then else in all cases, right? You would generally say, no, you're holding it wrong, just write the code differently and it will work for both cases, right? Like, for example, switch to embedded resources rather than depending on loose files on disk. And which I think is fair. Like, I think my only argument is that every time we do something that is fairly invasive, like eventually we would like to have an API that we can check because it changes something subtleties down the road that you need to react to.
Absolutely. And I think it makes sense for a variety of scenarios, not just single file deployment, right?
Yep, totally.
Blazor and all this other stuff. And I think the implementation of that API is pretty straightforward as well. We could just ask, is core lib available on disk?
Yeah, I guess that goes back to like, doesn't single file have two modes, like, you know, framework dependent and framework was it framework dependent and single file?
So it's got two. It can either load everything from memory or it can extract everything to disk. The tricky bit is that if you extract everything to disk, then it actually kind of works mostly. That all this stuff kind of just works. And so when people say, you know, my app isn't compatible with single file, usually what they're talking about is my app isn't compatible with loading everything from memory.
I see. So basically when you're framework dependent, you just
framework
extract.
dependent?
Yeah, you can do framework dependent. You just end up loading the stuff from, you do end up loading core lib from the disk.
Yeah,
so I guess.
Yeah, I thought
sure.
Static linking, we have two modes, right? Global static linking, where we include the framework, and then just the application stuff is statically linked. And for that one, we don't have an in-memory mode. We always have to extract that to disk.
No, so it's a question of whether or not the system libraries or the user libraries are embedded. So there are two axes here. There's a question of whether or not you're framework dependent.
Right.
If you're framework dependent, then you include all of the system assemblies.
Right.
If you're not, then you don't. And then there's extraction or load from mem. And if you load from mem, then everything, including the framework, is loaded from memory. If you are framework dependent, if you're self-contained, everything is loaded. If you're framework dependent, then just your assemblies are loaded.
I see. So that's basically so the check would realistically be, is the entry-level assembly effectively loaded from memory, right? Not if is core lib loaded from memory.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Although, yeah, it depends, right? Sometimes you only care about whether or not the system assemblies are lit. It's hard to say.
Yeah, I guess that goes back to like, what does the API give you, right? So that's why, yeah, you probably want to think about more what these APIs would be and like what you would do with those, because that's realistically probably the bigger question, right? Like, what does the user actually do in those cases? What code?
And that's why I've resisted adding this API so far, where it's like, I'm not exactly sure what scenario or how to generalize all of the cases. One case that I know that people are interested in is, are native assemblies, like give me the native assembly extraction directory if one exists. And that's, I mean, the is single file check isn't very useful for that at all.
But doesn't that kind of also apply to the one attribute is single file unsupported? Because is there an API that's only unsupported if your system libraries are loaded from memory, but if you're single file but framework dependent, then it does work?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, totally. I think that's true, but also it's better than nothing.
Yeah, I think, in terms of capability API, the one that seems the most useful, because looking at assembly location, assembly get file, and assembly get files is an instance member on assembly of is loaded from memory. I think it sounds like the current way that people detect that is if assembly.location returns the empty string. But we could make that an easier thing, and who cares? Internally, it could say was location the empty string, but at least now you have the notion of a programmatic check being in place that you could depend on.
But it's solely the marking other people's APIs. That's the real value of this proposal right now.
Yeah.
Right? It's the how do we mark third-party APIs as...
Yeah, or closures of these existing APIs.
Yeah, I think even if you look at our own stuff, I'm sure that we will find cases that are indirectly depending on this. Like, I mean, as I said earlier, like MEF is just one example, but I'm pretty sure there's corresponding ASP.NET APIs that have very similar. I guess ASP.NET doesn't support single file, but as you go up the stack, I'm sure you will find cases like that. And then the question is, what are we doing? Because we don't want to special case them all either, right?
Yep. WPF is a big one, right? The whole like query language stuff.
Right.
That what you would like to be able to do is just slap an attribute on it saying you can't use this. This doesn't work.
Although for this case, I probably would suggest WPF just handles that transparently and as part of their query implementation. That seems more useful.
Yeah, like if they can back it all by embedded resources instead of on disk, then that makes sense to me. But like I don't know their limitations there. And yeah, it would a finer grained attribute like the big problem here being what if I want to check if the assembly location returns empty? I now get a warning, right? The only recourse is to just suppress that warning because I'm checking to see whether or not I am actually loaded for memory. Like that is the recommended way. We could add another API that does that doesn't produce a warning. And I think that's very reasonable.
Or special case the analyzer in that one case.
Sure.
Yeah, adding the Boolean property feels easier in the analyzer flow. I could be wrong. I mean,
I don't know. They're both pretty easy. They're both not on the level of let's implement instance specific flow analysis to track the assembly and through aliases and
sure. I mean, yeah, they're both downstream of that problem. But
right, I'm just saying like that's a bigger. I agree with Emo's an original characterization that is a bigger question.
Yeah. I mean, the compiler obviously has some form of that because it knows, whether stack alloc can be assigned to things or not. But the analyzer flow may not.
Built.
Yeah.
And it is hard. As the author, I will say it's very hard.
I totally believe it. But yeah, so I think it would be reasonable to add a Boolean property on assembly for the capability check so that if one day we have instance-based flow analysis that you get the easy Boolean. That way we don't have to ask it for, okay, if they sent it to string.is null or empty, or string.is null or white space, or they did equal the empty string, or they did equal string.empty, or they did, string comparison.ordinal ignore case. The answer is use this Boolean and stop doing the comparison yourself. Even if internally we just do it as if location was the empty string.
But that raises that previous question of, do we want two attributes then? The one for single file unsupported and the one for, requires location on disk.
What would be a single file unsupported that is not requires location on disk? Like if we started with the specific problem and then waited until we had a generalization to use the bigger name, what would be?
If you're not asking something specific of an assembly, then you could never look for assembly.requires location on disk, right? Asking a specific assembly whether it's loaded from memory would never tell you about whether all the assemblies are loaded from memory. So if you're asking a global
the macro,
MEF is a good example, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think having a global, I don't know where we would put that. That's the other question. Like if you have something like, a single file, we would have to decide where to put this, right? Because one of the problems is that the only mode we have? Or will there be other modes in the future where, half the stuff is linked, the other half is not or something, right? These are the this is the problem with hosting models because there's so many, right? And then the question is, where should this belong? But I think practically speaking, we probably should have an API somewhere, because it seems that there will be workarounds people will have to make single file modes work, would be my guess.
Okay, so let's say we don't have a lot of information here. What's the change that we think improves the world, but is also flexible enough that we could change it later? It feels to me like some sort of single file unsupported, basically a global check, or global, like, if you have published single files true, then this thing warns. We could always introduce an is single file API later for that specific check. And if we want to drive down on things like assembly.location, we could probably replace the attribute specification in later versions of the framework from single file unsupported to requires location on disk. But it gives us some work now that is useful. Does that sound
sort
right?
of? I think it's half of the work. I think the other half of the work is for every API that you would like to get a warning for, you should be able to express in one paragraph of like what you want the user to do. If the answer is write your code differently and will work for both cases, if that's the answer for all of them, then I think it's reasonable to say you don't need an API. But if you have at least one API where it's like, well, in single file mode do this, when you're not in single file mode do this, then we probably need an API for that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was basically saying the API to check is single file or whatever is contingent upon finding the right scenarios for it.
Right.
But the single file unsupported attribute seems like it's a Pareto benefit. It just makes things better, and it doesn't necessarily lock us into keeping this attribute on things like assembly.location if we want to replace it with a more fine-grained thing in the future.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Right.
I still have trouble with the word unsupported. I think we should look for something more like impacted.
I'm fine with changing the name if people come up with a better one.
But yeah, so there's add the attribute so that the analyzer can start getting closure, or the method closures, reporting warnings. I think that there's value in having a property on assembly that replaces checking location against the empty string. It returns a Boolean because a Boolean is what you're after. Is this a memory assembly? It's independent of this. Yeah. And then third is my hosting model single file, or what is my hosting model? To be able to answer this question, I don't know where that one fits, so I don't have good names for it. But it feels like a third thing that can be deferred. I mean, the second one can also be deferred. I just think it's good to do.
So should we then just flip this back as needs work, and then you come back with more details, Andy? Does that sound right?
Well, I don't have a motivation for a lot of the other stuff. So the problem is that what I'm saying is adding this attribute seems good. Adding the other stuff seems Sure, is like fine. Adding assembly is loaded from memory. That's a convenience API. We probably wouldn't even respect it with respect to this attribute. So it's a separate discussion, right? Like, we're not going to use that information in any way when warning about this attribute. So
sure. I mean, like, that works for me too. Like, if we want to just scope it down to just we have this attribute, you swamp it on some APIs, we get a warning for that, then I think that's fair. I think I could live with that.
That's all I'm ready to design at the moment, right? With more user feedback or more stuff, we could add things later, but I don't have enough information to design anything more than that today.
Yep, that's reasonable. Yeah, so the attribute usage needs to be expanded to whatever seems more reasonable. Right now it's too constrained. I think we said we wanted to get rid of the customizable message because of globalization problems, unless it's localization problems. I can't remember which one's which. And then I would be happier if we could replace the word unsupported with something else, but Andy seems to not like my impacted, so.
I don't know, that's a little bit too weaselly for me. Like, sure, everything's impacted by everything. but I don't necessarily. I'm not opposed to a word change, and honestly, I don't care that much. Also, I have to jump to .NET Runtime Shitbroom.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with unsupported or impacted. I think to me the question is more like, what do you put in the actual message that you spit out? And I think this one has to convey the nuance, but I think that one is doable. In terms of expansion, Jeremy, what do you think? You think constructor and method is too restrictive? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, like the API catalog site seems to have gotten a lot harder to use since you updated it, but supported OS has assembly module, class, struct, enum, constructor, method, property, field, and event. I don't think struct seems weird. Also enum, I don't know why we said an enum wouldn't work on a OS, but so event, property, method, constructor, and I guess class and struct, if you want to just paint the whole type, and then maybe assembly and module.
Yeah, I can tell you why we did enum. Enum we did because there are some configurations in networking where we didn't want to mark the APIs that use the configuration. We just said if you reference the enum member, you probably are in for a surprise because that one never works.
Is attribute target enum the enum member, or is attribute target enum the enum type?
I think it's the enum member, but I remember correctly.
Okay, I thought it was the enum type. I'm like, you can't talk about the type.
I would be fine with just having it all. Like it would be completely reasonable in my opinion. But yeah, so I gotta go. Anything that you choose is fine.
Thank you, Andy.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
All right, so then let's go with all for now. Something else? Are we happy with the namespace? I think it seems like the right namespace based on where the other stuff lives.
Yeah, the namespace seems fine.
And then URL remains optional, right? Get set.
Yep.
Do we want to have a diagnostic ID, or do we think it's fine without one?
Actually, replacing message with diagnostic is probably reasonable, unless we want it to be. I guess we probably want it to be optional, so then there need to be overloads, or I guess that just means it's a get set property.
Yeah, that's how that works for attributes usually. So then we say we have a diagnostic ID property that is get set of type string.
Yeah, because that sounds that you can use it sort of like obsolescence of as we start getting sub areas of like, yes, you want the thing turned on in general, but the following 8 things you've already dealt with. So seems reasonable.
Then I suggest we just take the shape that we have on the other side and have basically diagnostic ID get set and URL format get set, and then the diagnostic ID can be referenced by the URL format, similar to how we do it for the platform compatibility one.
Sounds good.
We shouldn't take a message because they are hard to change. We should take a diagnostic ID. All right, so then let me paste this in and mark this as API approved. This thing ever comes back. All right. Corey, that's you, I think.
Yes. Can you refresh, please? Okay, you got it. All right. So WebSocket has an extension that allows message compression. These are all the nitty-gritty details to enable that. So we can talk about the WebSocket creation options class in a second as a whole, but if we look at the new members of it, it kind of shows all of the configure options that will be used. So first, we just have a bool to turn it on or off. Then we have the sort of maximum deflate window bits. It's basically the number of bytes described in bits of how large the compression window will be. Defaults to 32K.
Wait, what? 15 means 32K?
Yes, 2 to the power of 15.
So it's supposed to be a power.
I get it.
Yeah. So next we have this idea of context takeover. Essentially, the window is dynamic for a single message, but if you have takeover set, it means that the window will be persisted across all of your messages, potentially offering better compression, but forcing you to store this potentially very large window for every connection. And then you have the same ones for the server. And this is the client requesting this of the server. The server, it's essentially a hint. So now the WebSocket creation options, this exists for the WebSocket create from stream method. So the current create from stream method has a few parameters on it. We probably won't add new parameters to this, but just to avoid adding more and more overloads, I figured take the existing ones, add the new ones to that class.
Actually, famous last words, because there's another issue where we probably will end up adding another parameter, so the class is nice.
Yeah.
I was going to say, the moment that they add another RFC to say, well, in addition to deflate, now it supports gzip. It's like,
but I mean, even for the existing thing, there's an issue we have with ASP.NET where ASP.NET needs to be able to differentiate behavior with basically customize the abort behavior for a WebSocket. And so there's another issue where we're discussing the ability to provide a delegate that's invoked upon WebSocket.abort. So that would naturally be, a property or something on the creation options rather than in addition yet another overload.
Great.
Right. And so, Corey, did you say that if you're a client, the server max window bits is actually something sent to the server as a hint?
All of these are hints. Because it's an extension, the server can reject compression completely. It can assign you a smaller amount of bits if it wants to save memory, if it has a lot of clients, maybe. So all of these are hints.
Right, but the client will send to the server the server max deflated window bits value.
Yes, all of these options are things sent to the server.
Okay. And if you is server, then the ones that say client just don't matter?
Well, if you are a server, then it kind of works the opposite way. It's like, will I accept compression? What is the maximum window bits I will allow the client to have? So the server will then send negotiated values based on what the client said using these.
Okay, so I guess my question here was really, do all of the properties matter in both directions? And it sounds like yes, you just need a PhD to understand what they do.
Yeah.
No kidding.
We could potentially leave the use deflate compression property off for the server and just have it ignore the extension or something, but
So what happens if on the server I want the client to support more max window bits than the client wants to, or something of that nature?
It just claims
what
this is the
happens
best
when there's a
compression it
disagreement?
managed.
Okay.
yeah,
So
it's
I mean,
essentially a minimum, but in some cases the server is allowed to just ignore what the client asks for and use its options instead. This API doesn't actually have a way for the client to know what the server brought back. So even in our API, they're just purely taken as hints.
so as a client, you kind of trust that the server is going to pick reasonable values for these, or
Yeah. If we wanted to add additional APIs, we could. You can send this extension multiple times saying, this is my preferred option, but if not this, try this. It didn't really look like it was in wide use, so I left it off, but we can add that in the future.
yeah, if anything, I'm looking for ways to simplify this, not add more things to fiddle with.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't want to learn what all these options need, you can set use deflate compression to true and have decent defaults. The options are really for if the client or the server is trying to optimize for low memory environments.
And then I know there was some talk of making it like a WebSocket wide like option versus a per message option. I guess we haven't gotten there yet. Or...
So there is a per message option on the RFC, but we're leaving that out. It would have just been extra APIs, and we haven't really seen data to see that people would use it just yet, but we can add that on later cleanly if we need to.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I don't see a problem with that from ASP.NET's perspective. I mean, obviously, we've been without the feature for how long?
Right.
So in this new design where you have the WebSocket creation options as well, do we foresee that there's always significant overlap between the two classes? Like in other words, if we add a new thing, are we very likely to add it in both places?
Pretty likely. The difference between the two is one of them is used when you create from stream, and the other one is used when you create from a URI.
Is there anything in client WebSocket options that is not in WebSocket creation options?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about that offhand.
Because one possibility would be you do create the new type for the 3 things you have plus this other thing, or either we overload and take the client, it's now slightly misnamed client WebSocket options as a 4th parameter, and now they're inherently kept aligned. Or we make a WebSocket creation options which has a client WebSocket options poorly named property. Just wondering if we can use one type for 2 things.
So the client WebSocket options does have additional properties that are kind of specific to connecting via a URI.
Okay.
And the WebSocket creation options is server and sub protocol, which maybe we could pass as parameters if we really wanted to, but didn't seem super worth it trying to figure out how to put these 2 classes into one.
Yeah, I mean, that's the trade-off, right? I mean, it just seems weird to me because if you have things that are kind of in sync, we will screw it up eventually, right? That's why I was asking. Because I mean, other option is to just introduce a new type and use it from both places as well, right? I don't know. WebSocket settings or something, and then both of the settings for property, right?
Yeah, like I'm slightly wondering, do we want, like, right now you have the three things that already were thought to make sense, plus a bunch of things that are related to this one extension. And then if, I'll just say gzip because it's another compression scheme, gets added and it uses very different notions of control, like, would we want some sort of grouping, like basically a deflate compression properties or deflate compression options is the property, and then it has these four things in it? Or is that, am I thinking too far ahead, and we don't really need that level of affinity for indicating what things tie together?
I mean, that would make it future proof. New extension might come out. My current view is WebSockets is actually going to be obsoleted in the near future.
Obviously, because we're adding
I
support
don't honestly know how many more extensions are going to be defined for it. But if we wanted to be safe, the comment I have here says take these and make it a deflate compression options class. And I guess we could use a base class or something to make it just one property.
You mean it would be deprecated together with HTTP 1?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jeremy's proposal is not actually that bad, because it even if we never add another one, it wouldn't be too weird, and would immediately able to share the settings conveniently, right?
Right.
Kind of like that actually as a solution.
So can you repeat what that solution is?
Well, I guess the idea would be we take use deflate compression all the way down to server deflate context takeover, and we would basically put them into a new type called WebSocket deflate options, and then we would add this as a property to both client WebSocket options and WebSocket creation options. And so this way, if we add another setting for deflate, it's in both places. And if we ever add something else that is not deflate, like gzip, then we would add a new type for that.
And then presumably use deflate compression isn't there, and it just whether the property is null or not decides whether it's used or not.
Yes.
So would we have a deflate compression options property, and then in the future, like a gzip compression options property, or would we have just one compression options property?
No, I would just have two different properties. And if you said both, you would just fail, or say, oh, we try first this one. If it doesn't work, we try the other one, or whatever the behaviors we want.
I mean, presumably, if it got added, there would be a, how are you supposed to resolve if the client supports both, right? Presumably they send both things in negotiation and the server responds with which one it wanted to do.
Right.
But, yeah, so especially without, because the next thing could be, instead of gzip compression, it could be, I don't know, something I would say related to keep alive, but that's already built into the thing. Some other notion of something that we haven't ever thought about. And so then it's great. These four properties talk about how you want to do deflate compression. These 6 properties, which are a different type, talk about how you want to do future other thing. And then, yeah, we end up with somebody adds the gzip compression extension, and it looks exactly like the deflate compression thing, except it says gzip. And it's like, well, I guess we could have reused that, but oh well. Just seems a bit more scoped in purpose, and then we don't have to worry about, like, oh, we need to put deflate in the name of all of these properties to tell you that they're all related to deflate compression. So it would be, deflate compression connection options or something. And then it would have client max window, client context takeover. Like, you get to simplify all the property names because the type is providing their context.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. The reason I kind of flatten them out into this one class like this is we kind of took the same approach in sockets handler of not creating a new class to cluster options that need to be set together. But I think it's fine and perfectly usable if we want to create a new class.
Yeah, I mean, another question is, what sort of usage pattern would be expected? Like, if you're gonna have customized options, if you want, it seems like you're probably going to have a set of compression options that you want to use maybe across multiple sockets because it's, there's a thing about your application, but that once you're needing to configure the other things, it's how often are you going to build the thing versus you just built these are my deflate options. To go build a WebSocket, here are the deflate options. And so that's another reason that it could make more sense as a separate class.
Yeah, just put it on the screen, what I just mentioned, to make sure that that's what we all agree to.
I think you can get rid of deflate in all of the property names of the deflate options.
Can I raise a somewhat orthogonal but general issue here about these kinds of option classes moving forward? I wonder, with C# 9 adding records and better support for immutable objects, should we be moving more towards making options classes like this immutable and manipulating them as mutable objects instead of making them mutable? Because there's certainly advantages from having these kinds of things be immutable.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I don't know enough about records yet to have an opinion on this. I mean, normally the argument against immutable data types is that they're much more harder to use, basically, because you have to have either constructors that take long number of arguments, in which case you have this, colon syntax that people have to, think about. And if you want to change one property, you either have that, which makes things slightly more ugly to use. Assignments are easier for most people, but I think the record syntax makes that easier, but I haven't really looked into this in great detail yet.
So I do have a innate concern with using records pretty much anywhere in .NET runtime. They are a really cool thing and they're great for applications to use, but for one, the surface area that gets generated for them is not baked yet. So, we don't really have control over what APIs are showing up for a record. Lots of stuff shows up when you create a record. And the second is related to that. You define a simple record and the amount of IL and assembly that gets generated for it is staggering. Because everything has withers, there's equality overrides, there's constructors, there's, interface implementations. It's all this wonderful, toString that pretty prints all your state. Like there's a ton of stuff that's really useful for someone who's writing an application, but for folks like us that care a lot about control and size and being slim and whatnot, I have a lot of concerns about us gravitating towards creating records, especially in public surface area, but even in implementation.
So that makes sense. On the other hand, if that concerns me because that says that we can't take advantage of the features that they are adding there. Potentially.
Yeah, that's true. I think I have aired that as part of the design, and it's not really meant for us, from my perspective.
So my knowledge of this stuff is like I spent 20 minutes reading the blog post over the holidays, but I know that there's some features that are sort of like that are more like general immutability capabilities and some that are specific to records. I don't know if there's an option here where we could not literally use records, but still make stuff immutable and get enough of the benefits that the disadvantages of using immutable objects are no longer an issue. I don't know if that's the case.
No, there are. So for example, like I would have no qualms or very few qualms with us using init-only properties, which solves the constructor issue that Emo was referring to. Init-only properties is sort of a language level feature. You could still use reflection to get around it, but basically it lets you define an immutable property that you can still set as part of an object initializer.
Right.
So you could say new WebSocket options, and inside your braces, you could set whatever properties you want to set,
but after the new statement, the language would no longer let you set those properties.
So is that a viable option do we think that's a good way to go for stuff like WebSocket deflate options or similar option classes that we might define? Like we have a bunch of option classes for quick.
I think that's great because right now we have all this code in HTTP client and elsewhere to make sure that people don't set the options after we start using them.
I mean, yes and no. I guess it depends on how much you care about other languages, right? Because I don't think that, for example, F# will be on or init only.
Yeah, and the runtime doesn't respect it if you write IL.
So I believe
I like that it gives you docs, though, that makes it clear that you're not supposed to be mutating this even if you're using F#.
Yeah, I mean, you can still have the guards in the code.
Well, the question I think would be, I don't remember where we landed, but it's possible the C# compiler emits a poison pill in the form of a mod op or a mod rec or whatever.
I see.
That would actually prevent it from being used by another language.
Yeah, that might be also the killer then, right?
Fair enough.
Yeah, so it seems like we should definitely look into this. I mean, in the past, the way language features used to work is that they are more composable, where you can, when you take, for example, link, you can use extension methods without using link and stuff like that, right? So maybe the apply method that they have is a general pattern that we could use that would work without buying into all the records, for example, right? So I think there's certainly, like, I think what's totally true is that building something immutable today in the framework is a lot of manual labor, and it's not great to use, right? So if we could make that easier, I think, or what would definitely be better. So
yeah, I mean, I think that while the C# guys are off trying to make immutable stuff better, it seems worthwhile for us to be working with them with the hope that the things that they do to improve immutability will allow us to use that immutability in more classes, in more areas in the BCL. And if we can't do that, then that feels like we haven't really solved the problem entirely.
Yeah, that might be a bit stark as a statement, because I think as Steven said, right, there's multiple layers of concern, right? And very often, like, we also don't want the reverse, right? Because we have these advanced requirements that, people at the language level, or at the application layer can't have nice things, right? So I think records is a bit more towards that, right? Rather than towards us, but...
I buy that. I'm totally happy to say, look, records is an app thing and it generates a ton of special handling here, but I guess I'm kind of getting to the sort of layering argument that you were making, which is that whatever they're building ought to be layered in such a way that we can opt into the stuff that helps us use immutability more broadly in BCL classes without paying the full price that an application is paying when they're using like the whole full-blown record capability.
Right.
And then I'm sure that, wherever we find is a nice happy medium, we'll then throw it at a CS1 usability test and find out we've made a platform that you can't onboard to. See also spam.
Yeah.
All right, so like in the absence of that, so like are people happy with the API that I'm currently having in, I guess? Yeah, I already updated the deflate one.
So I have a question about the max window bits. So I've been skimming the RFC, and I probably missed a lot of it, but it seems like the client sends the extension first, like the extension payload with the bits that it wants to use for the server window and the client window. And then the server responds with either the same numbers or what it chooses. If I just want to use whatever, on the server, if I just want to use whatever the client asks for, how do I specify that?
I think that's kind of up to the implementation. I would be treating these as maximum values. So it's what the client wants as a maximum, and it's also the maximum that the server would accept. So the server will negotiate the minimum between the values.
Okay, I think that makes sense. I was just curious. All right.
Yeah, and presumably the actual implementation, the max window bits aren't going to be simple get set with an initializer because they're going to throw for negative numbers. But
Yeah.
that way we don't have to do that check everywhere that reads this thing.
Right, and that's why like max is in the property name and all that. So yeah, makes perfect sense.
But yeah, the shape and the general notion of we're providing defaults that are good, and yeah, to Jeff's point of, if we could be using things like get init, then that would allow us to have a nice singleton of deflate options.default. But I don't know that we want to. That's not worth doing all the gymnastics for I'm a locked type without having a good pattern for things. And with Steve's concern that either we're cutting off F# or things get weird with non-C# languages, I don't know that we're ready for get init yet. So.
I had a question. I'm sorry this was answered earlier, but any given WebSocket is either a client or a server. Do the other set of properties have meaning in that case?
All right, Corey, I'm going to try and answer, and just to see if I understand. That's really the test here. The client says what it thinks the server should do, and when you're the server, you have the ability to restrict what the client will do. So either side sends both, or has both things, and whatever gets negotiated is the minimum of either of those properties. But the roles are named for which role and not for like me and other guy.
Yeah. Yes. If we wanted to make this clearer, maybe we could maybe use local and remote instead of client and server.
I don't know. I mean, now you need to think about who you are for local and remote. I like client and server because, am I the server role or the client role based on the is server property?
Yeah.
Not that this should be the reason. It also lines up a little bit more with the RFC, which
that is a consideration though. Like someone's going to read the RFC, and we may as well, unless there's a good reason to not use that terminology. It's at least a reasonable first choice,
So I think the general point is the client sends a suggestion to the server, and the server sends an answer to the client. So both sides need both numbers.
Correct.
I see. Okay.
Cool. Are we
I
happy
asked
then?
earlier, and it means I understood the answer.
And I basically asked the second time, so yeah, it's confusing.
Yes. This is what I said you need a PhD to understand.
I think the deflate options properties should be nullable, but other than that, looks good.
Fair point.
Oh yeah, question marks. We really like those now.
All right, then. Why do I keep going into the wrong thing here? Alrighty. David, that is you, I think.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So this issue is about parity with newtons of JSON. Well, but basically, just to give a bit of context, on 5 we added a reference 100 preserve property in order to have the parity with newtons of, and also have an alternative that can deal with circularity in an object graph when it is serialized using system.text.json. So preserve was able to satisfy the need of many people stepping into the circularity problem, but there was some audience still asking for not using preserve, but rather they will prefer to use something that is like ignore on newtons of. So this is the proposal to satisfy that need. Some motivations for that is not just the people asking, but the payloads created with preserve. First of all, they're not like JSON spec friendly. And also they might be too cumbersome and might increase the payload size in the worst case scenario. And also when you serialize with preserve, the JSON created is incompressible for serializers rather than JSON.NET and system.json. So that's why this option comes in handy. Basically, it's just having one static property next to preserve. That's called ignore cycle. And the way to use it is similar to the other one. You just set it and you just forget about it.
And will this ignore only when you're, so basically a stack approach of you've already written down this object in the current set of curly braces?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, but if you had if the top level thing has two properties and both properties are set to the same reference, it will write it down twice.
Yeah.
So it's different than preserve, which will restore the fact that they were the same instance, but it's basically when you were about to throw an exception, don't, right?
Yeah.
And it just says it's null.
No, it doesn't set it to null. It just ignores the whole property.
Sure, which means in JSON terminology, it's either null or undefined.
Yeah.
Seems reasonable.
Well, if you want to scroll down a little bit, there's some considerations or risks to consider with this that people that is opting in for the option should be aware of. One of we have already discussed them in the past when we were discussing preserve. One of them is the silent loss of data. Given that the object, let's say that you have a list, and one of the elements will cause reference loop, or will be the beginning of the reference loop. It will be ignored, and then your list, instead of having, let's say it had 3 elements, now it's going to have 2. And that's one concern. And the other one is that it's also unable to round trip the data, right? Because it's not, it loses the integrity.
I mean, I think similar to last time, I'm still somewhat at loss in how somebody reasons about ignore cycle. Like, because I mean, that sounds great in principle, but like if you have, for example, a tree where nodes know their parent, like I don't know whether set the parent to null or the child will no longer appear in the child collection, right? And for correctness, probably only one of them will work, right? So I don't know how I would use this and make sense of the output of this.
I see. Okay, so in your example, the children will not print or not include the parent in the payload, right? Because that's where the reference loop is detected.
Well,
but doesn't that depend on the order in which the parent property is alphabetically after the children property, right? So that's probably why that happens, or in metadata probably after or before that, right? So that's why I'm saying, like, I don't know whether like it makes sense if I think about how you walk the object graph, but at some point you detect a cycle and then you drop that object, but I'm not sure when that is, right? It might be the parent property that is dropped, or it might be the children, the child that is dropped, right? And so in that sense, I don't know how I would reason about that. So like,
well, it has to be the child, right?
If you take something like a binary tree that also has a parent reference, if you start with the root node, it already had null for parent. It goes to write down a child. The parent is already in the object graph, so then parent becomes null. Everything makes sense. What gets really weird is if you do the left child of the root, because then it will write down, basically you just reparented the whole tree, because it will write down its children, and then it will write down parent, and then parent won't write down left child, it'll write down right child, and then keep moving on, because the left child was now the new root. So if you start from a root of a tree, everything makes sense. In a graph, it's wherever you ended up. But changing the length of a list does feel weird, and now it feels like maybe sometimes you want to actually insert the word null, like, which maybe breaks an assumption. Yeah, all right. Now we're back to why this is a controversial feature. Cool.
Yeah, I think that's why I said last time, like, it makes more sense to me that somebody has to put JSON ignore on the places where they want to break the cycle, right?
Yeah.
But, like, yeah, I mean, I understand it, like, that's how JSON.NET works today, right? So if your code already works, I can see that being convenient, but, like, as an author of a library, I would be not very eager to use it.
I didn't want. Sorry, go ahead.
Out of curiosity, is there? I understand that there's prior art in the .NET library world. What do other languages? How do other languages deal with this? Like maybe Go or Java or some other? Do the libraries? How do they handle these self-referential problems for serialization to JSON?
If I remember correctly, Java. The libraries for Java doesn't have any weird semantics that as preserved. So the coder needs to add JSON ignore properties manually to each property that will cause a loop. That's one. And for Go, there's no other workaround. Right, other than throwing exception when the reference loop is detected in order to avoid Stack Overflow. They just throw a recoverable exception.
So they rejected the feature request that we're entertaining.
Yeah, that seems to me like are we opening up Pandora's box of like literally no one will ever be happy? And so it's just we constantly add a feature and then inevitably it becomes, ignore loop 2 because it has slightly different semantics because we need to do something else or we have another preserve that modifies the behavior again. Like I'm not sure if we can win with this feature, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think
or we go specifically and say, like, I think maybe I may have missed this, but I think someone said that, like, let's say Newtonsoft does it a certain way, and we say, and the property isn't preserve or ignore cycle, it is Newtonsoft compat. Like, it's very explicit. It's like, this is a quirk for compatibility, not necessarily a conceptual idea.
Yeah, that has other problems, though, because the question is, can we actually replicate Newtonsoft enough in that word setting, use, WordPerfect 6.0 compatible footnotes or something, right? I mean, like, it might be very hard to do that without actually running Newtonsoft JSON entirely, right?
Oh yeah, agreed. This seems like one of those things where it's like we may be trying to solve a problem that is it worth solving?
Are the reference handlers something that someone can write themselves, or is it an enum?
It's a class you can.
No, yeah, you can derive from it. That's also something that we added, and that's why we decided to make the reference handler a class rather than an enum.
So we could basically post this as a sample of if you want Newtonsoft's ignore behavior, this is the closest that we've come to having it, and we put it as a sample and then don't add any API.
I see. Not really, because we don't have anything. So that's also another downside that I wrote just right after the risks is that, yeah, you can extend the reference handler. No, above that, you can extend the reference handler preserve semantics and handle it. I mean, and you can create your own reference resolver class to handle with all of that stuff that is happening. But I'm just using an internal flag to discriminate whether we use preserve or ignore semantics, right? So if you want to write your own reference resolver and reference handler for ignore, you wouldn't be able to do that.
Are there any APIs that could be added to reference handler to make this possible?
I guess you can just put a knob like a bool or some enum and say that you just want to just ignore semantics rather than preserve ones. And we can also, we can do that on top of this just to well, not necessarily on top of this, right?
Couldn't you say that in the references resolver, do you have an API today called getReference, right? That given a value, you give it a string-based ID.
Yeah.
Couldn't we just say that if that method returns null, it means drop?
Not really, because when you do getReference, like for example, let's say that when you do getReference, you already wrote the property name, so you are not able to ignore it. But well, you could write null maybe or something like that. So it will be total. It would be full parity with Newton's law.
I mean, you could change the thing to call the resolver before you write down the property name. That shouldn't really be detectable by other values, right?
I'm not sure if I get the question.
Well, you said the problem is you've already output the name of the property to the stream, so now you have to write the word null.
Yeah.
But what if you called the handler before you wrote the property name to decide not to write it?
Well, then you will have to do to get calls to get property to get reference, right?
And you would just need to save the property name somewhere, call the handler. If it returned the don't write me down value, then not write it down, and otherwise write down the answer. Like, it seems, without seeing the code and how far apart the two things are, it seems doable. Also, if you're outputting to something rewindable, you just need to revert your position a little bit and then start writing again where the previous property had been, depending on what your model is. So I mean, it seems like a solvable problem to make it where, if in reference handler, if we add a const somewhere of that the reference ID is, do not omit or something, and if you return that we just don't write the thing down, or null or whatever, because I don't know if null makes sense already.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely sure like how the interaction is, but like the other question is like, I mean, even in the reference resolver, you don't know who, like, you don't have any context of the graph, right? You only know the value that is being written right now, right? So if you want to have a rule like, always ever, never drop parents, only drop children, or the other way around, right? Like, you wouldn't be able to implement that because you wouldn't know which property this came from. So
I mean, wouldn't you use state?
Sorry?
Like, you're saying it wouldn't be possible to write a reference handler, even if you could return, like, omit property from getReference to do this? Is that the claim? That it wouldn't be possible to do JSON ignore cycles as a custom reference handler?
Yes, today you're not able to do that because the reference handler doesn't have the ability to do that, right? The reference handler only constructs a reference resolver, and the resolver is basically just a thing that has a very simple API that given an object gives you a string ID, and given a string ID gives you back an object, right? So that's the only interaction model we have, and so there is no notion for do you want to ignore this? But the assumption is you always have to be able to produce an ID, and given an ID you have to be able to produce the object.
But you don't think it could be tacked on the way we were discussing earlier with?
No, I think the claim is that it can, right? It's just that either you have a new method on this, or we just change the semantics of getReference and make it nullable, right? And then say like, the thing that calls the API today would have to be able to do the thing, and just drop the thing on the floor then.
But you were saying like the reference resolver wouldn't have enough context to know if there's a cycle or not.
Well, no, I wouldn't know whether there's a cycle, right? Because you know whether you saw the object before. It's just that the handler or the resolver still doesn't have any control over how the graph is being traversed, right? So you still don't have the context of like, what was the path that it was requested through, right? You would just say, you know, the serializer walks the object graph in some order, and then the best you can do is you say, if I see the object again, I drop it on the floor, right? So you have no notion of saying, oh, if the reference comes to this edge, then I do something differently when it comes to the other edge, right? And that's the kind of thing that I think Aaron mentioned earlier. Like, do we have confidence that the way our serializer traverses the object graph is the same order in which JSON.NET traverses the object graph? And the answer is probably no.
But in this part I missed earlier, and if it's too complicated to explain, fine. But as far as ignoring cycles is concerned, why does the order you traverse the graph matter? Like, it's either apparent or it's not.
Well, I guess it depends on what you want the outcome to look like, right? Like, as Jeremy and I was discussing earlier, it kind of depends on where you start your traversal, right? Like, so if you have a tree, right, you have an intuition that you say, children are always there, but parents may not be, because that's logically the back pointer, right?
But I get it. You can start the graph anywhere.
Yeah,
anything can be the root of the graph.
Exactly. And so now the order may not be what you intuitively expect the outcome to be, right? And so this
But
goes
the
back
root
to
is
the
always
whole
just
dropping
the
data.
object you deserialize, right? So the root's always the same, like for any given object.
Yes.
Right,
maybe.
but imagine you have a linked list that has skip links in it. If you went to, if Newtonsoft did skip 10 before it did next, then that will change the structure of what gets serialized between the two serializers, because you'll
but
get
it won't
the same
change whether
place
something
just
was. Oh, sorry.
So you start from the same root, and then if we hit skip 10, then we write root skip 10, and then now we have every 10, and then from those now we have the slices of 9 that go forward for what the path to get there was, versus Newtonsoft JSON may have produced root next, and all the skip 10s are null.
I'm just saying, no matter which order I from a given root, no matter which order I traverse the graph, like a given node is either a cycle or it's not. Like, it doesn't matter what order I traverse in, right?
But it matters, if you're trying for compatibility, it matters which property got read first to determine if it's already a cycle.
Right. So you change which properties have been set, right? So that means, yes, you will have the right number of objects in the outcome, but the way they're wired up, it might be different, right?
So your link recovery.
But we're not trying to get rid of duplicates, just cycles, right?
Right.
So
but
it's either a cycle or it's not. Either it's already exists as its own parent or it doesn't.
Sure, but consider normally, doubly linked list, right, with previous and next, right? So yes, you would only expect in the list has 10 elements, and then you basically have the 10 elements in the serialized output. But do you expect always the next to be set, or do you expect sometimes next to be set, sometimes previous to be set, right? Like you want a consistent outcome, right?
I get it now. Thanks for explaining it.
And that's why I said earlier to me. That's why I said earlier to me. I don't know how you reason about the output of it. I mean, if you only care about the objects being there or not there, then sure. But like, you generally care about which properties are set, right? So that's where I have had trouble with this policy of saying ignore cycle, because it seems to me arbitrary, right?
I completely get it now. Yeah, it is kind of arbitrary.
Yeah. I mean, this is a non-standard usage of JSON, right? This cycle handling. So who are we compatible with? Is unpredictable output going to change how Newtonsoft deserializes our objects? Like, I don't think that having byte compatible output is necessarily something that matters, because you're already making it significantly more intended for machine processing and not necessarily for reading.
I think the concern would be more like Newtonsoft isn't going to know how to rehydrate the links inherently, but if you were using a doubly linked list with Newtonsoft JSON and you found when you serialize it, it always sends next and prev is always null because you would have always been in a cycle at that point, that you build up a thing that reruns the linking and you've written the code, and now you you get a payload from us because you're trying to change which tech you're using, and now that crashes because it turns out that due to the order we walk the properties, we always saw prev and never saw next. Or somehow magically it's because of subclassing, some of them set prev and some of them set next, and now you have no idea what to do.
So the worry is that the user is manually processing these references rather than letting the library do it for them.
Because it can't. They threw away that data. So it's that they're trying to rehydrate something without putting references in there.
Yeah, it's not about the JSON. It's more about like after the JSON has been deserialized. Right?
What do you do with it?
Yeah, do you know which properties are null and which ones aren't, right? And how like
I think in the actual issue there was like this exact problem. Someone tried to do this with entity framework. And you know, like the whole issue here is JSON should be able to be the lingua franca between the contract. It's the contract definition, and it by not adhering to what JSON is actually good at, but by enriching it with its own concept of this referential thing that literally doesn't exist, we're creating JSON X. And if everybody doesn't respect JSON X for how to represent a graph, well, then by definition, if you don't all use the same JSON serializer, deserializer logic, it's useless.
Well, that's a slightly different problem, right? I think so. If you ignore cycles for a second, if you just talk about preserve the reference identity, then yes, I mean, we cooked up our own scheme on like how we refer to objects, right? And I think it was inspired by what JSON.NET does, or it might even be identical, right? Because it's just a pseudo syntax where we say we have special property names with prefix of $, right, to indicate that. And but that to me is kind of orthogonal. My question is more like, given an object graph, you run the object graph through the serializer, then to the deserializer. Can you reason about the resulting object graph? And I'm saying when you say ignore cycles, you can't really do that because it seems arbitrary what is afterwards null and which ones and which ones aren't. And that to me seems problematic, right? Because even if you abstract the wire format entirely, it seems like you put your objects into a thing that almost arbitrarily drops data, and then the question is, did you expect that data to be dropped, or did you expect other data to be dropped? And so, can you actually reliably process the outcome of that?
I see. Sure. For what's worth it, Entity Framework has this problem, right? As you mentioned, and given that they have these back pointer properties. Like they have IDs of the parent and the child, or they have a list of childs. It doesn't matter. They don't suffer from the loss of data that ignore causes, right? So in that scenario, I think it's a good way to apply this feature.
So I didn't understand what you meant by that. You're saying, given the constraints of the feature, you think this will work well enough? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it will work for Entity Framework.
The thing that scares me the most about adding it, as having talked about it for a little bit, is the order we walk the properties right now basically can never change in the serializer. Like, if it's currently alphabetizing, it can't change to do the order that they happen to be emitted in the IL. If it's alphabetizing, it can't do the order that a source generator felt like spitting them out, unless like that order has to say, like, because if somebody does try writing together some wire this backup logic, a new version of the package coming in because of transitive dependencies and changing which things happen to get walked first, therefore where the nulls appear, will destroy them. So I really think that the better idea is to be able to come up with a way that the reference handler can describe this without using internal state, and then write it as a sample and never put it in the framework.
So, okay, I do feel like really dense here. Can someone in the issue perhaps like write an example object where if you had like the emit cycle, you would come up with like two different possible serializations based on the walking order? Because like I'm thinking about the doubly linked list scenario, and like there could be a lot of duplication, right? Starting from head, you could basically repeat each element twice, but eventually Yeah, I don't know, but if someone could write a comment, that'd be great.
I think the link comment in right there, the 40099, it has an example that illustrates how we lost an element in the list. If we start from the root if we start as if the list was the root, or as if one of the childs is the root.
Wait, so you're starting with different roots? I thought we were talking about starting with the same root and just walking in a different order.
Well, that also will be a problem, right? Because
exactly.
Right, but so Stefan, think of the doubly linked list, right? So you have a prev and a next. So you write down the first element, whatever you consider the first element to be, the thing that you pass to the serializer. If the serializer sees next as the first property to write down, then in the object it writes down second, prev will be null, because prev has already been written in this object stack. But if it happens to hit prev before next, then prev is set, and then prev's next is null. And then if the order is consistent for all the values, then you can build a relink them by whichever prev or next wasn't set. But if it's arbitrary or changes between versions, you're screwed.
See, but that's what I don't get. So you say you have the head, right, and it has prev and next. So for the root object, both prev and next won't be null, assuming that it's not linking to itself trivially. And then for the prev, right, the prev's next will be null, and for the next prevs will be null. But that's deterministic, no matter which order I walk it in.
So imagine you have a linked list, right? A, B, C, D, right? And then you have a root object that refers to the first element. But now the root object also refers to the last element, right? So you have a first and a last, right? Now the question is, if you serialize this outcome, you can now traverse the list, either going through the first and then you go next, or you can reverse the list with going last and prev. So it depends on.
But don't you just duplicate until you get back to the original root object?
Well,
yes.
Reserialize everything?
Well, no, because so if you serialize this root object that has the first, last, and the pointers, right? The question is now, well, do you find an object graph where first is set to a non-null value and then all the next pointers are populated? Or do you get a first that is null and a last that is non-null and all the previous ones are populated, right? Because they both will serialize, like they will both be valid outcomes of that algorithm. It depends on which order.
But like all the next and all the previous will be calculated until a parent shows up in a link, right?
Yeah, assuming that it's implemented as a object stack and not as an object set.
Right, exactly. So I'm thinking of it as a stack way, and I think the rest of you are thinking of it as a set because you're trying to remove the duplication. And I don't think that's what this issue is looking for. It's just looking to remove the cycles, not the duplication.
Right, yes, that's correct.
But it does still change. Like it changes. The concern isn't so much with a given serialization, can you figure out where the data was? It's, can we make that serialization be stable for all eternity? That's,
I think for a given root, you could, right? Like, no, it doesn't matter which order you walk for. If you're using a stack to just eliminate the cycles,
it depends on, it changes the code that you need to write if you're trying to deserialize it and recover the links. And if you see
that's a non-starter with this, right? You're omitting the links.
No, so it's, you have the doubly linked list. If we see prev first, then you write root, or you write element that you saw, and then prev. Each of those prevs have another prev, but don't have a next, because the next was already written in this stack. Mm-hmm. And then if in the next version, something changes about the order that the serializer sees the properties, and now it writes next, your code that already understood how to link things because prevs were set and nexts weren't, assume it's degenerate and you have a cyclical doubly linked list. That, you know, you wrote the code to wire things back up, and now you're getting nulls because it saw the other property first.
But I'm saying the JSON object would be exactly equivalent in that case, right? Because you're using a stack. So you'll have like all the prevs and all the next, and there'll be a lot of duplication in the case there are cycles. But like there won't be an actual cycle in the JSON.
I guess yes. In the case of a doubly linked circle, from the root, it would write the whole list out for each path. Each one would just not know about the other, or the parenting direction.
And you can never like recreate the cyclical object graph from emit cycles anyway. Like,
yeah, it still feels very. The problem is when there are multiple paths to get to a thing through the same stack. That where whichever one you hit first makes things become null randomly, and that feels problematic. And why?
But it's not random though. Like things don't become raw randomly. You just have duplication because you're not like fully utilizing the links. Like you just reserialize certain objects if it's not its own parent. But it's not like randomly at all.
But that's the thing, right? Like, how do you know something is a parent?
Well, the serializer would need to have a stack of references in addition to the existing resolver set, which I believe is the set, because it's, if I've ever seen this, write down this was /1.
Right, but like I guess that's my point. It's like a parent is kind of a function of like, you know, a depth first traversal of the object graph, right? But
it's not though. Like whether something is or is not a parent, it just depends on like.
Is the serializer currently serializing this thing, which is a stack state?
Right, but if it tries, okay.
Yeah, but that's kind of my point, right? Because there's no inherent like parent-child relationship in object, right? It's just which edges are you walking first, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So there's one path where it is a parent, there's another path where it's not a parent, right? Because it depends on which edges you're choosing, right? So if you just do a depth first traversal, it totally depends on in which order you work the links, right?
But what I'm pointing out is like when you serialize, right? Like from a given route, like depth first search or breadth first search, you're trying every single path, and on a given path, it's either a parent or it's not. And I guess that's the part I don't understand. Like if you're trying to serialize every single path, there's either a cycle on that path or there's not.
Right. So like I think that's well defined whether you have a cycle or not, right? But the problem is ignore cycle says the first time you detect the cycle, you break it. But there's multiple different ways how you can break the cycle, and that's resulting in this ambiguous outcome.
I thought we were just emitting it. Like I thought that was the API proposal. You just emit the rest of the graph as soon as you detect a cycle on a given path.
Right, but I guess that's fine, except that there's multiple different outputs you can produce that are all valid.
So that's all I want. If someone can just, because I'm clearly confused. If someone can just show me like an object where you emit cycles and that's all you're doing, and you start from the same route and it serializes differently based on how you walk. That's all I want to see.
Yeah, that's basically what I said earlier with this example of you have a root object that has first and last for a linked list. Right? Because if you first go through the first pointer and then you go, you know, next, you have a different result if you go through last and you go pref.
But it's the same result is what I'm saying, because you just try every single path and then you stop once there's a cycle. But it's hard for me to prove that something doesn't exist. Like all I need is one example to see that it
maybe I just have to, but I don't understand what you mean by you try everything past, because that's not what we do, right? We just do the walk, and then the first time we see an object again, as we're serializing it, we drop it on the floor.
Exactly, and I'm saying that's deterministic. But maybe it's not. But
well, it's deterministic, like depending on the order in which you read it, right? So if you
no, that's what I'm saying. Is it's independent of the order of the walk as long as you attempt every path.
So you're saying that basically, basically what I'm saying is, if you have a randomizer at every single time you ask for child properties, you can have different
outcomes. It wouldn't make a difference.
And you're saying, I mean,
it would change the order the properties are printed, but it would be the same JSON object. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't think that's true.
Hold on. I'm not sure if I'm understanding the concern, but to respond to Stephen, the dictionary, for example, it's non-deterministic. So when you serialize a dictionary, the elements might come in a non-deterministic way. So that's how you might end up with different results.
Yeah, I'm saying without a deterministic order of walking the children, you should still be able to come up with a deterministic result JSON object. Like if you're ignoring like the order of the properties in the JSON
if you're using
mattering.
If you're using the same root every time, yes.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. And like Noonsoft's had it for a while, right? Like I don't think it's been a huge like problem for them.
Yeah, it's been I don't know when they introduced it, but yeah, it's been sitting there for a lot of time. That's why people is asking for something like that, because they don't want their payloads to have all these weird semantics that they're not so used to them. And also because, like, for example, if they send JSON to JavaScript, they need something else to be able to understand the preserved semantics.
Yeah, I think Stefan may be right. As long as this model uses a stack instead of what we currently have for reference handling, which is a universal set, then you should end up with a lot of duplication, but nothing complicatedly surprising. So in the doubly linked list, or Emo, in your case where you have first and last and it's doubly linked, first and last both write down the whole graph, where first writes down everybody with a next pointer and last writes down everybody with a prev pointer, and it was just it repeated every node except the root. In a cycle, it's whatever you start and it'll walk both ways until it hits back to itself. Again, it's massive duplication.
Yes, I agree with that.
If you add a dictionary as a value of itself, then once it hits itself, it stops writing it down, but it still writes down everything else squared. Like, so it may actually make sense. You will end up with complicated parent nodes and stuff are broken, but I was trying to get it with my skip list, and I realized that as long as it is stack based, everything ends up working. It just ends up that no one can really reason about the data. Like you'd basically have wanted to ignore all the skip pointers and just rebuild them from the raw data. But I'm having trouble figuring out where you get surprised. I mean, you maybe can't rebuild your data because there's not enough stuff to know whether this should have been null or actually should have been a link to something. But that's what you said you wanted to do. I don't like that we're using the existing reference handler feature to put the serializer in a different mode, and that the APIs we have wouldn't have allowed someone to write this themselves. That displeases me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of a good way of fixing that, but
the reason for that is that when I was testing Newtonsoft, and where you are able to combine both features, preserve and ignore, you get some weird scenarios, right? Like, for example, what happens to be first? Do you preserve first and you emit rev, or do you detect cycles first?
Yeah.
That's why they are both on the same class, and you cannot opt in for both features at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the only part that does feel like it maybe wants more thinking is for something like a dictionary, should it write down the key that now had a reference cycle and then say null? If it's a list, should it change the length of the list, or should it write down the word null? The like disappear this property even if ignore null is true feels really weird in a list, unless ignore null is already removing items out of lists.
I don't know if writing null is something better than ignoring it, because you were already changing the payload. Why adding null will be better?
Well, because if you have a structure that has the array of data and a, how many items should I see? Like you wrote down 6 items and then the list was only 5 items long. Versus if there was a null in the middle, like that's a thing that you could handle. It's degenerate, but it's weird because you're changing the relative, or you're changing the index of things, especially on an indexed list.
Yeah, that'd be my concern. If someone
that's
was
where it
using
gets weird
indexes.
Sorry, can you describe what you just said?
You send, here's the state of the world, which includes a list, and you say, and I want item 3. Well, if item 2 happened to be an object cycle, then you'd no longer want 3, you now want 2, because what got transmitted on the wire and what the world looked like to you weren't the same thing. The indexes after a dropped reference all change.
Unless you replace it with null.
Yeah.
Well,
if you write the word null, then it's still thingy sub 3 is what you were talking about.
That will only happen if you start serializing with index 3 rather than world, right? Because world is the parent and it's not going to be contained in the list. Does that make sense?
We're assuming that item 3 would be omitted because reasons.
Yes, assuming that you have a complicated list that the second, or that an element in the list was already a parent object that you're in the process of writing down.
Yeah, exactly.
But the concern is that it completely dropping it out of a list changes absolute indexes, and it changes the length, and that feels like maybe some people want it and some people don't, and that's the only part that feels really weird to me.
When you say
if we didn't
changing
have
the
list
length,
support,
what do you mean by changing the length?
By removing an item.
You expect this array to always have 4 items in it. Now it has 3. Because one of them was the object you were already serializing.
Right. Like I mean, as long as you can reason about like it's a parent, I think that seems fine because you're specifically saying you want that, right?
Maybe. I mean, it depends on how complicated your world state is. Like if you have a list of things which can contain a quote unquote parent object, and you have I'm the selected element in the UI index 3, but now that's out of bounds because you removed a previous item. Like that's weird.
Yeah, I think dealing with cycles is always going to be weird to some extent. Most of the time, cycles I think are going to be directly in properties and not on lists. But I mean, there will be behavior, right? Like you either replace the cycle with null or you omit the property. And if it's null, you put null on the list. And if it's omit property, I'd remove the item from the list for consistency.
Yeah. So I mean, it may make sense to just say treat it as null. And if we skip null items in lists when writing them down, then that's already a weird behavior we have, and that makes sense.
I doubt we do that.
If lists, even in ignore null, say write down the word null as that was the 3rd item in this array, then this should write down the word null. I think. Probably. Unless it's Tuesday.
I mean, I guess my other question is like, is there any way we can preserve cycles at all?
Well,
that's the other feature.
Right, not with this.
Well, I thought preserve would basically preserve object reference or like integrity, but would throw when you have cycles.
No.
So preserve literally preserves everything, including cycles.
Yeah.
Right, because if you see a value you have ever written down in the payload, this is why preserve is universal and ignore is stack. If you see an object you've ever written down, then it just writes a back reference instead of writing the object.
So I guess then maybe my question is like, why does anybody want ignore cycles?
Preserve something that JavaScript doesn't understand. You'd have to rehydrate the object graph based off our arbitrary implementation of preserved handling. Ignore cycle is just send a bunch of crap to the browser and let it deal with it.
Yeah, in my experience, people who
I
use
see.
ignore cycles don't care for the cycle, don't want the cycle, are interested in a completely different part of the object graph, aren't optimizing, and just want the thing to serialize.
Right. Really, ignore cycle is you didn't think about your data model. You probably meant to be sending identifiers, and instead of sending identifiers, you sent objects, and that when somebody clicks a button, you're sending them like a gig of data. So really, it means you're doing it wrong, but people don't like to hear that.
I see. So I guess so. Preserve basically does our pseudo syntax of the dollar stuff, right? And then if you just say ignore cycles, you get regular JSON, except for the parts where it's a cycle.
Right.
And the ignore cycle.
Ignore is if we were about to throw, then write down null, whatever it means to write down null.
Right.
Right. And what I was about to say, sorry about that, is like somewhat counterintuitively, the ignore cycles, as Jeremy was alluding to earlier, can end up with a much bigger payload than the preserve cycle, which contains more information because of the duplication.
Right.
So yeah, preserve cycle is like you're not losing anything and is more efficient. But if you're just like naively walking an object graph in JavaScript, then it might mess up.
Right. I mean, I think strictly speaking, the correct fix would be just mark your back pointers as JSON ignore and then have them patch up, right? That will be the ideal, in which case you don't write a ginormous output and you have total control over what you want. If you don't want to do that, then yeah, maybe, presumably, assuming that we can have a deterministic outcome, which it sounds like we can, then yeah, you just do the big switch and say ignore cycle and live with the outcome that produces.
Yeah. As long as it's stack based.
For sure.
Which is
definitely
different than the existing reference handling feature. But yeah, my opinion, which is being written in an archive right now, is anybody who wants this feature is doing serialization wrong. Like they meant to serialize IDs, instead they sent their whole object graph. And I've seen that on various web properties. You look at like how much data was transmitted when you selected an item, and it's like there was some flight dispatch software that I was using that, looking at a simple thing about like what planes I had permission to check out sent me the maintenance records on all of those planes, even though it wasn't visible anywhere in the UI. Why? Because they sent the object graph instead of, oh, here are the like 6 identifiers. So everything was sending the entire database every time, basically. And
I know in the like legacy SignalR, we used Newtonsoft's ignore cycle functionality because we were lazily serializing to like a WebSocket or whatever. And when a WebSocket was detected, we didn't want to kill the entire WebSocket connection because we couldn't like close out the JSON object or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. Like, so we kind of made the decision for our users. It might have been better to air out in that case, but just kind of an instance for where that was used.
All right, then. So what I'm hearing is we don't have really a concern with determinism. We don't really have a concern with the fact that we will shrink lists or /arrays based on cycles. So then it seems like we all agree that this feature is unfortunate, but like there also doesn't seem to be any sort of ship stoppers for that either.
I mean, I do have concern with list indexes changing. I don't know what the right answer is, but I do have it as a concern.
You're screwed. That's the answer.
Right. But I think that saying we treat it as if it was null, and whatever that means for ignore null semantics with regards to lists currently, is a behavior we can stand behind.
I like that too.
My guess is we write null into the payload whenever there was a null item in a list, even if ignore null is set to true.
Awesome, I guess.
And that's what this should do as well.
Well, that may have other issues if you do that.
Yep.
So I'm not sure that's necessarily better. You're just trading bucks at that point.
Yep. If you have a list where list members contain references to the thing that has the list in the first place, you're going to have a bad day.
I don't really think you are likely to have like a list of super like well-known, well-organized types that references a parent. Like I do think we're splitting hairs a little bit. Like, yeah, but we'll see.
No, but it's a thing that could bite someone, so we should be deterministic and have a test for it.
Yes.
That's my main concern, is that we have a test for it and we know what we're doing and we be able to explain it and such.
So then, to the second point, you would prefer to
right, and like part of this comes back to if we have a list right now or an array or whatever, do we write down nulls even when ignore null is set to true? If yes, then we should write null in these cases. If we would skip them because ignore null was set to true, then sure, skip them, I guess. Or we'll get a new ignore null flag of ignore null except for duplicate references in a list. So
Hold on. Do you mind explaining that again? Sorry. The part of the ignore null thing.
So right now, if you serialize and you have whatever the ignore null thing is set to true, and one of the properties is a non-null array or list or whatever that has a null value in it, do we write down the word null even though ignore null is set to true?
Oh, yeah, we do, because ignore null only works for properties.
Right, and so that's the behavior that I think that this should have as well, is if the cycle is detected, treat the value as if it was null, whatever that means. So if it's a property value, then you either write down null or not, depending on what the ignore null state is. And if it's a list item, you write down the word null.
What if we had a second option that is called replace cycle for null, something like that?
No, no.
First of all, I wouldn't. And secondly,
yeah,
I would just say, like, I wouldn't bother with that because, as we said earlier, like, it seems like no matter what policy you're picking at this point, like, you are having a bad day. So I would just pick one that is self-consistent and move on with life. Because as Stefan said, like, it seems contrived anyway. Like, why would you have a list with cycles? It seems not very naturally occurring.
What would you serialize and update with cycles?
That's way more common. Including like a parent in the list.
Yeah. Having cycles is easy.
Well, yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. And certainly with certain like graphs and stuff, you can absolutely have a parent in the list. It's just not super common.
All right, since you're the only one still on the call not talking, Aaron, do you have any other comments?
Nope. I think that I was here for the next one for the com thing, so I don't think that's going to happen today. Is my guess. So
since we're 34 minutes over,
yeah. Nope.
Is it a simple one, or is it a long one? If it's a simple one,
it's going to be simple mainly because everybody here is going to roll their eyes because it's com.
That is certainly true.
It's just like, yeah, we don't care. Leave me alone. Like, that's usually what I get out of this conversation. But that's fine. I can wait. It's entirely up to y'all.
Yeah, so this one looks easy to me. Like, basically, you're just adding new creation flags.
I'm adding 2 new creation flags. One of them actually already exists. We're just documenting it. And adding a API that completes the COM scenario for aggregation. That's it.
Normal overload suggestion is that new parameters go at the end. Does this one have to be inserted?
No.
Like, because if it really wants to be the 2 pointers sitting next to each other, then like that makes sense and it's common. Who cares?
It's common because that is I can give you. It is similar to the. Let me make sure I can show you this. It is. Well, does it really matter at this case? I'm trying to find a good example of where this actually exists.
Yeah, I know that our reflection APIs were terrible about this. We insert parameters in the middle of other things all the time. But so this is really just the general advice is that the parameters maintain positional semantic. They're not the same type, so it's okay. Like you don't have the complication of the second int means something different if you have 4 parameters than 3.
Oh, sure.
So it's excusable. Just it's generally nicer that you say, oh, you want this more complicated thing, add a comma at the end and do it instead of insert it as the second parameter. But if it really makes sense that you would have the 2 together, then
it does make sense. Only because, yes, it does make sense because they represent. Well, I guess you're right. It doesn't technically matter. Yeah, I can put it at the end.
Field is what appeared in my head as soon as you said they represent.
I can absolutely put it at the end. It does. It costs nothing. It costs nothing.
All right. So approved, but move int pitter inner to after object wrapper.
I will even move that. I'll just move it in the actual proposal. Sure.
Yeah, but I was already copied it.
All right, and that everyone.
All right. Is this what we want? Then we approve that and move on with life.
Let me.
Possibly under quorum, but as Aaron said, it's calm. No one cares.
Good enough.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
All right.
And now you don't need to come next week.
Thanks, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
See you.
Bye, people online.